Let's just take a historical perspective for a minute. Humans have been here for a long time, but the thing that we call civilization, which was much larger than tribal scale, starting to organize, early Egypt or Sumeria or whatever, since the beginning of that larger scale coordination, a tiny percentage of the people that ever lived in something like a republic or a democracy. They almost all lived in feudalism or monarchy or some kind of much more top-down autocratic system, which is actually quite easy to understand because the proposition of a republic or a democracy, a participatory governance, is actually a wild proposition, which is that a huge number of people who don't know each other, who want different things, can sublimate their desire and difference to coordinate with each other. It's like, that's actually kind of, it's understandable that's a hard thing, right? This is why corporations aren't run that way. Corporations are autocracies. And so the few times throughout history that a republic or a democracy emerged, they're actually really kind of worth studying. And I'm going to simplify here, but it's a fair simplification. They emerged following a period of a cultural enlightenment for that culture. And the cultural enlightenment's always had at least a couple things in common. So if we look at the kind of early Greek democracies, the Athenian democracy, of course we can criticize that there's a lot that wasn't perfect about it, but it was a movement in the direction of more participatory governance. It was following the kind of Greek Enlightenment that both had a very high value on classical education for everyone. Let's have everybody learn history. Let's have them all learn philosophy. Let's have them all learn formal logic and rhetoric and the arts and these types of things, so that everyone can have a sense of how to know the true, plus the good and the beautiful, right? Like all of it, an integrated sense of those. Understand what types of systems worked and didn't work in the past because of more kind of knowledge of history. So if everyone can basically sense base reality on their own well, which has to be trained, right? Like there's actually training involved in that. And then there was also the value of the Socratic dialogue. And in the Socratic dialogue, everybody is being trained to be able to take every perspective. I can argue this side, then I can move around and argue this side. If people are being trained in that kind of dialectical process, that means I'm being trained in seeking to understand the perspective of others and actually be able to argue them even better, which is steelmanning, right? Well, if you have a bunch of people who can all understand reality on their own well, and they can have high quality conversations and take each other's perspective, not just go into tribalism and otherness and make a villain or a straw man of the other, those people can start to have the kinds of conversations to share sense-making that leads to being able to make collective choices. And then they don't need rulers, and they can say, like, we can throw the rulers off and do a participatory governance system. The European Enlightenment, which led to the foundation of the US and a reformation of a lot of kind of European and other global governance, the kind of modern era, similarly was the Renaissance, right? The idea that people would be Renaissance men or Renaissance people who actually train in lots of disciplines, not just be specialists, because it's very hard if someone's just a specialist to make sense of the world, right? And or for them to talk to each other across those specialist languages. So the idea of Renaissance person and then of natural philosophy and science, that we can actually empirically tell what's going on and have the same conversation based on that, plus kind of the Hegelian dialectic. We can seek a thesis and then seek an antithesis and then see, is there a higher order synthesis? If people can do that well, a town hall is a possible thing, and a republic or a democracy or participatory governance is a possible thing. If that starts to break down, where people can't actually make sense of reality on their own well, so they're taking the view of authorities who can then be captured because of the power of that and used for power purposes, and they can't take the view of other people well, they can only basically make straw men and fight against them, there is no possibility for collective choice making, which is what a democracy or republic is about, collective choice making. If there's no capacity for collective, the antecedents of choice making is collective sense making, collective meaning making, and collective conversation. Collective sense making of what's actually going on, and what do we anticipate the effects of a particular action to be. Collective meaning making of what's important. Well, we're focused on different things that are important. Can we factor all of them and try to come up with a design solution that is good for all of them? Right now, we don't even have a process in democracy for that. We have somebody's focused on something, they come up with a proposition to benefit that. They don't even think about the fact that that proposition harms other things because they're focused on the subset of values they're focused on, which is why almost no proposition gets 100% or 0% of the vote. It's like 50% because the people who are focused on what it benefits really want it, and the people who are focused on what it harms really don't want it. that inherently and unavoidably polarizes the population against each other. Because I see the thing that you are desperately trying to make happen is actively harming the thing that I hold as sacred and worth fighting for. So I have to hold you as an enemy, right? But it was because of a dumb proposition. It was because of a proposition that didn't even try to get, hey, you don't necessarily need that economic thing to go through, or that tax policy or that oil policy. You need your kids to be able to have an opportunity for a real job and to be able to own a house someday, like not be in economic servitude forever. Well, if I hold just what is the value without the strategy that's attached to it that contextualizes it having to happen that way, I'm like, that's fair. Economic servitude's a problem. And I don't hold that that thing can't go through. I hold that we don't want to extinct species in this area. You're like, I actually like forests. Not extincting species would be cool. I'm willing to do it if that's the only way my kids aren't in servitude forever. If we start by taking what are the values that everyone holds and say, is there a proposition that does a better job of meeting these? And can we use some collective sense making for collective design? Well, it's like, that's so obvious once you say it, and that's not in our democratic process at all. But it also requires people that can have a good quality conversation and seek to hear what other people's values are and would want to seek not just the immediacy of war, which then, of course, you never just win forever, right? You win, and the thing that won, the other side reverse engineers, makes better, and comes back. And so then you just get an arms race and an escalation of narrative warfare, info warfare, mimetic warfare, tribalism, physical kinetic warfare, all of those types of things. You know, when we say that most people throughout the history of civilization haven't lived in democracies or republics, and that when those have occurred, they've occurred following periods of cultural enlightenment, they also then haven't lasted very long, right? Historically, they've lasted 300 years at most of the time. And of course, every empire breaks down. No empire lasts forever, which is one of the kind of key insights, is that right now we have a fully globalized system, and it's in the process of breakdown, where all of the previous systems did break down, but they were localized. And so the consequence of this is different in kind. But the democracies break down much faster than many of the dynasties and other types of top-down systems, because it's just easier for a small number of people to coordinate with each other than a large number of people. Right? You think about it, it's kind of like if somebody is a bodybuilder, it takes a lot of work to keep that much muscle on, right? They have to be working out and eating all the time, and the moment they stop, it starts breaking down, because it's actually very expensive. Well, it's actually very expensive to keep a whole population highly educated and highly engaged, not just kind of in their own life, but really paying attention. Like, most people don't want to go to jury duty. They don't go to town halls. They don't really want to pay attention to the issues well. And this is part of why the breakdown occurs, is if somebody works very hard to fight a revolutionary war against a tyrant, or to try and overthrow a tyrannical system of governance or whatever, they have an embodied knowledge of what the bad alternative is. And they work very hard to make sure their kids have that. So that's why a Washington or a Franklin would say those types of things, right? Like, that it's utterly necessary for everyone to have this kind of comprehensive education, because they know what the alternative is. But as time goes on, and 3 generations pass and 4 do, the idea of a monarchy or of a totalitarian system or whatever is just not even a thing. We don't have any embodied relationship to it. We aren't scared of it. It doesn't motivate us to do the very hard work to understand how to be actively engaged citizens. And there's stuff on TV, right? And there's like stuff to do, and there's social interests, and there's whatever else. And so there is a lack of generational knowledge transfer of the real critical issue that someone fought hard to form a new system. So the basis of what it takes to make that system ends up breaking down. And we can see we are at a place where this is not a system of for and by the people. The people, at best, every 4 years get riled up over a person that they didn't really have much to say in which people were even there, or what they do propositionally, or anything else. And so what I would say is, you know, the US is at about 250 years since it was founded. They don't make it past 300 years. This one has had more pressure to break down on it, because since World War II and the Bretton Woods world, it's been the center of a global order. So everyone who's wanted to change the global order has had a maximum incentive to try to influence DC in various directions. And it's not that hard to flow money into the DC structure internationally towards whatever your personal interests are. It's not that hard for a foreign actor, a state actor, or a non-state actor to be able. So it's not just economic capture within the country, it's also international. And this is not just for the US, this is everywhere. The US just happens to be a kind of central example right now. But it's not that hard to have money go from a sovereign wealth fund or something like that into an international IGO or NGO, into a corporation in the US that has certain kinds of veils and protections, or a nonprofit, into the Washington, D.C. think tank, nonprofit, political action campaign complex, and start to purchase legislators and get senators invested in doing the bidding of particular things and whatever else. And so when both the left and right feel like the nation is on the brink of existential collapse, they're right. The integrity of the thing actually is. Their answer as to what the solution is isn't right. So this one will not continue to actually be a republic and be able to help influence the rest of the world in a positive direction. It just won't. It is in kind of a decay process. The question is whether it decays into just less and less function and irrelevance, or whether it decays and reboots. And if we reboot an actual kind of meaningful participatory governance, and obviously that's a US question, but it's a global question. And in order to do that, a cultural enlightenment as a prerequisite is necessary, right? The cultural enlightenment of, is everyone recognizing that collective choice making has to be based on collective sense making, collective meaning making, collective conversation? And are we starting to really invest not in doubling down on our own bias, but in the capacity to make sense of things well, the capacity to understand why other people are thinking the things that they do, and what signal is in there, and what noise is in there, and the capacity to communicate well so we can coordinate? Either that becomes a widespread value that we start investing in and training in, or it will devolve into autocracy, and we should actually put attention on trying to pick how to make it a better monarchy than a worse one.